The Unity editor consists of a number of different windows to help you organize, create, and play your game. We'll bring our assets into the project window down in the bottom, bringing in all the pieces from 3ds Max or Maya, for example, or textures from Photoshop. We'll add them into our project and organize and categorize them in folders and by name. We'll assemble our scene then in the Scene View window, bringing in those assets to a particular scene. A game level may be made of multiple scenes, and a game may have multiple levels depending on how it's constructed. In the Game View, we'll play our scene, clicking play at any point to test it out and run around and see if our level is working. The hierarchy keeps us organized. We'll open up one or more scenes here in the hierarchy, and in each of those, we can select the objects that are in that scene and sort them by name or by transform. In the inspector, we'll modify the components of a particular object. In this case, for example, changing the color and intensity of the directional light that's the sun in our scene. We can add in components either by dragging them into the inspector or by clicking on Add Component at the bottom. And we can organize here in the inspector by tag and layer to cull down what things work or don't work with, limiting down raycasts, for example, or how many lights hit an object. The console window helps us with debugging, listing out logs, warnings, and errors over the course of building our game, so we can get everything running smoothly and optimized for our platform. You can change your interface as much as you'd like, simply by grabbing the tabs at the top and dragging them. I'll take the scene view and drag it over next to the hierarchy, and it'll affix in that spot. Now I've got a scene and a game side by side, and I'll drag the dividing line between them over to see both. For example, I may want to play a section of my game and see what's happening in the scene as well, and this lets me have side-by-side windows to do that. I'll grab the scene and pull it back, and it's now next to the game again. If we take a window and fly it off, it's now a floating window, so we can have our scene working over things. For example, you may want the animation window to float out over the rest and bring it forward and backward as you need to work. When we have a layout we like, we can save it. We can also revert back to some default layouts if we need. By choosing Window and Layouts, here's our default layout, a 2x3 split, a 4 split, tall, wide, and we can save a layout. I'll go back to default here, and my Unity editor resets the interface back to the original configuration. The Unity editor also has two different looks, depending on the version you're using. In this case, I'm using the Personal Edition, the light-colored skin. We can change this by choosing Unity and Preferences, or File and Preferences under Windows. In Preferences, we can see in here the editor's skin. Depending on which license you have, you'll have different choices available. The Professional skin is dark and recognizable by its charcoal theme throughout. The Personal skin is lighter and recognizable by the light gray. If you'd like, you can go further into colors and configure how different things look. A play mode tint, for example, changing it from gray over to green so it's recognizable that you're in play mode. You can use the default and reset back at any point. Now that we have an overview of the Unity editor's interface, we'll take a deeper look at what each of the windows do and how we can use them to put together our Zombie Toys game. The Scene View window in the Unity editor is where you'll actually assemble the parts of your game. We'll use this Scene View window to put together the scenes that make up a level or multiple levels in our game and navigate around to get to what we need easily. We'll use a combination of the mouse and Alt-Option key to navigate. Holding Alt or Option and left-clicking orbits around the scene view. Holding Alt or Option and clicking the mouse wheel in pans side to side or up and down. Holding Alt or Option and right-clicking zooms in the scene view. Alternately, you can scroll the mouse wheel in and out to zoom. We can also navigate the scene view in walkthrough mode. I'll right-click and the mouse changes to an eye, and this shows that I'm in walkthrough mode. Now I can use standard keyboard navigation, W for forward, A for left, S for back, and D for right, in concert with orbiting around the scene. I'll look around and move forward. In this way, we can navigate our scene much the same way we will in a game, and it provides a great way to test it out and see things from a player perspective. To select anything in the scene view, simply click on it. I'll click on the stool here off to the right, and we can see that it's identified as the stool in the inspector and also on the left side in the hierarchy. Pressing F in the scene view focuses in, framing that object at the center and bringing it fully into the view. We can filter how we see the scene view as well. Looking in the different view modes under the Scene View tab, we can see we've got shading modes, shaded, wireframe, and shaded wireframe. I'll switch to a wireframe, and we can see just the wireframe outlines of all the objects in the room. Switching from wireframe to shaded wireframe, for example, shows the shading on objects and the polygon edges. In addition to shaded wireframe, we can show things like the alpha channels or the overdraw in our scene. Overdraw, for example, shows objects being drawn over each other, as the name suggests, showing us how many things Unity has to think about in depth as we see them. We can look at select channels in our materials too. Here's the albedo, for example. This is the raw, unlit color of each material. We've got a specular. Where is it shiny or not, for example, and how smooth is that material? Lastly, we can see the normals on each one. Which way do those polygon normals and any normal maps think they're facing? We've also got a number of different views for our global illumination. Emissive, for example, shows us objects that look like they're emitting light, such as the stars on the bedroom wall. I'll switch back over to the shaded view, and now I'll turn off the scene lighting. Right now what we're seeing, and I'll hold Alt or Option and orbit over and zoom in, is that we've got moonlight coming through the window, lighting up the floor and the wall. To turn off the scene lighting and return back to default lighting, we click on the light icon next to 2D and shaded here in the top bar in the scene view. Turning that off returns us back to default lighting. This may be easier to see if you're assembling and lighting a scene that's dark and need to see objects in clear light to position them. I'll turn my lighting back on and switch over to 2D. We use 2D primarily for assembling 2D games, as this is still a 3D world, but we're seeing it flat at the moment. We can also use 2D mode to work on UI elements, assembling them flat if they're seen in screen space. We have a choice in here as well, over hearing sound. This is actually the background music I'm playing for the game. If you'd like to hear the sound to be able to test it at a certain point and see what's playing, you can turn that on. And finally, on this line, we can turn off and on things like skyboxes and fog. These are different things we use to really enhance the look of a rendering. Fog to put a haze in the view, flares on lights when they're very bright, and a skybox around. Are we actually seeing the wraparound sky that's part of our daylight? These all help us configure the scene view so we can get to what we need and see just the parts we want. We can also turn off and on different gizmos using the drop-down. We can choose to show a grid or not, and are we working in 3D icons? Then we have a long list of both scripts we've put in. These are the scripts that actually run the game currently, and built-in components, things we'll use in Unity on different game objects. We can turn off and on things like animators, cameras, canvases, colliders, depending on what we need to see. For example, if we're just placing objects and we know we have the colliders in, how things will interact physically with the world, we can turn them off so it doesn't clutter the view and we're simply seeing the polygon objects. We may want to turn off lights, for example, once we have them all placed, so we're not seeing multiple icons overlaid here in the scene. It's up to you how you configure this. As long as you can get to this list, you can check and uncheck whatever you need to make your workflow more efficient. We can see where we are in the scene view then, by the scene gizmo in the top right. Right now, it shows me that I'm in perspective, as we can see here by the label, and that Y is up. Clicking on any of these axes spins that scene view around. In this case, I'm in the left view. I'll click on the blue Z axis and go to the front. This actually spins to a perspective front view. Clicking on the viewport label, in this case front, takes it to a front isometric, a flat view, and clicking on the label again returns. We can grab this cube and spin around as we need, or click on the cube and run back to a perspective. Again, this exists so you can get around as you need and really see what it is you need to see to make your work more efficient. So use the scene gizmo and the different filters and view modes to view your game. Remember that a scene may be comprised of several hundred objects, and you shouldn't have to view everything all at once. You should view just the parts you need and clearly define what it is you need to see and don't see. Now that we have an understanding of the scene view, we'll take a look at the game view and the differences between scene and game. The game view window differs from the scene view window in that in the game view, we test our game as we're building it. I'll click on the Game View Window tab, and we can see here the starting state for our game. We've got a camera showing our two players, ready to pick them, whichever one we want, and play. In the Game View window then, we can choose how we see it and what are we seeing. At any point in the game, we can simply hit Play to test. I'll click Play, and I'm ready to pick my player. We can see also in here in the Game View window our UI in the right place, ready to choose the player, and there's the other elements laid over it, as they haven't been told at the moment to turn off and on. In the Game View window, we can choose how we see it depending on our device aspect. I'll drop down here under Free Aspect and choose 16 by 9, playing this game on a high-definition television, for example. And we can see the Game View window is now boxed on the sides, showing us only what will appear on screen. Maximize on Play maximizes that game view when you press play, taking up your whole monitor so you can see things full screen in the right detail. Muting the audio once you've got the audio in place is helpful. You may not always want to hear that theme over and over, or for example, you may want to just look at things without hearing all the different sounds associated with the characters. In our Game View window, Stats allows us to see what's going on with the game internally. How much memory are we using? What's our CPU? And what level are we dealing with in sound? What's the sound level? And are we connected to a network? How many meshes and so forth? This is useful for optimizing a game. We may discover in playing that there's too many draw calls we need to optimize further for a desired platform. The statistics let us see, while we're playing, what's going on. Lastly, in the game, we can turn off and on our gizmos. For example, turning off and on things like sound and otherwise, using the drop-down list to configure, much like the scene view. So if we'd like, while we're playing, we'd like to see where something is, maybe an empty game object or where an audio source is, we can turn that on and see it here in the game view. Remember, the game view is here for testing. At any point, you can press play or Command or Control P. I'll play and choose a character, and I'm ready to get in and play my game and test it out. The Hierarchy window in the Unity editor provides an outline view of all the objects in the scene, including duplicates. What we can see in here is that I've got selected the stool object in the completed Zombie Toys game level. On the left side then, stool is selected, and it's also showing in the inspector on the right. The hierarchy then lists everything in the scene, including the duplicates, and shows prefabs and parenting. The stool, for example, by opening up the arrow, shows that it actually has colliders as children. These are called stool collider, and they're capsule colliders around the legs, so we or other characters can't walk through them. We can parent in the hierarchy, and we can view things in a number of different ways. Staying organized is important. We can see in here everything is named, and we can search by name if we need. I'll start by switching how this view is arranged. I'll roll up the environment, and we can see it here in the hierarchy window in the top right, that we can work by the transform child order, or by clicking on this button, switching over to alphabetical. And now things are sorted alphabetically in here as we name them. You may find with your naming convention, you end up with alphanumeric prefixes or whole alphanumeric strings in a naming convention, rather than nice names like the actual names of the object. This way you can sort very concisely, looking for everything, maybe ENV for environment, for example, and so forth. In our hierarchy window as well, we can see that things are color-coded. Boy, for example, is a prefab. That's the boy character we'll use in the game. A prefab is shown in blue, and that means that's been made a special kind of object, a prefab here in Unity, which we'll get to later. The hierarchy view differs from the project in that the hierarchy only shows what's in the scene, including duplicates, whereas the project window with its list and assets and scenes here, for example, shows all of the assets in the game. So all of the things showing in the project may not always appear in the hierarchy view of a particular scene. We can sort in here in the hierarchy view as we need. Remember that there may be several hundred game objects in a scene, so being able to find things clearly is important. I'll click up here in the search field and search by name, looking for example for BLOX, blocks, and I can see the different objects that have that partial string in it. This is not a full name. As we can see, some objects are named blocks, some have a number after, some are blocks colliders. Unity will search for a partial string, a piece of a name in this case, and list anything that has that for selecting easily. Everything else then in the scene grays out, and I can see just my blocks objects, the building blocks here on the floor, isolated. We can search in here as well by name and by type. I'll drop down here in the search field and look by type, and I'll look for light. Searching by light then shows every object that's a light. There's a select spot for the characters, spots 1 and 2, moonlight, the fill lights, which are point lights in the scene, and so forth. In this case, these all have different names, but they're all the same type of object, a light here in the Unity editor. I'll return my search back to all and look at other ways to use the hierarchy. Most of these assets we've brought in from another program, 3ds Max or Maya or Photoshop and so forth, but some we've created here in Unity, and we can create a number of objects in the hierarchy if we need. I'll click on the Create button, and I can see in here a choice of different Unity objects to make. I can make empties or empty children, 3D objects, and under 3D are cubes and spheres and so forth, 2D and lights, and all kinds of different things in my Unity editor that I'll need. We can create them here in the hierarchy, for example, 3D object and cube, and we have a cube appearing at 0, 0, 0, or roughly so, and with a scale of 1 by 1 by 1. I'll select it and can rename if needed simply by clicking on the name, calling this cube A. We can also delete straight from the hierarchy. I'll press Command Delete on a Mac or Delete on a PC, and that object will be deleted from the hierarchy and from the scene. We can right-click to access that menu as well. Right-clicking and choosing, for example, creating empty, duplicating, deleting, copy, paste, and our 2D and 3D objects. It's up to you how you'd like to work. Either method is acceptable. Either one will get you objects made quickly. So remember to use the hierarchy to organize. Organize your objects by name, by type, by class, and nest them in. We can parent right here in the hierarchy simply by dragging objects. For example, I'll make a new light and parent it under lighting. I'll right-click here in the hierarchy and choose light and point. I've made a new point light. We can see it here at 0, 0, and it's called point light. By dragging an object onto another object, we can parent. So I'll take my point light and drag it onto lighting, an empty game object. It's now parented under lighting. Lighting, if we select it and look in the inspector, is an empty game object. It simply exists as a transform in the scene. It's useful sometimes for grouping things, parenting them all under one object for easy selection and moving around. To unparent then, you just drag the object out from under the parent. I'll take my point light and pull it back right in the middle of background environment system until it shows a line here in the hierarchy, and it's no longer parented under the lighting game object. I'll delete this light, and I'm ready to organize my scene in the hierarchy, navigating around and picking what I need and parenting to stay organized as I build my game. The inspector window is where we'll actually work with the components of particular objects here in the Unity editor. I'll select, for example, the dresser in my Complete Zombie Toys project. We can see with it selected, it's actually called drawers, and there's a number of components listed under that. We can see in here that because this is a game object found in the scene, it's got a transform at the start, something every game object needs to have. Under that then are the different components that make up that, well, chest of drawers we see. There's the drawers object looking for a mesh called drawers, a mesh renderer, where we look at different shadow properties and materials and also how it participates in lighting. Under that, we can see the different colliders applied to this object, a couple of box colliders and a capsule, making sure that we can't walk through this object. We can see in there, in these components in the inspector then, where these objects are and how big they are, how they're sized, and in case of the capsule, which way it's facing. Lastly, way at the bottom, we can see the material, called drawers material, and what kind of shader it's using. Opening up this arrow next to that sphere shows us the different properties of this material, in this case a standard specular setup shader. As an important note on the inspector, if you're in play mode and you make a change, those changes won't stay. For example, with that object selected, I'll press play. I'm here in my game, and I'll move the center of this capsule collider to 6 and press enter. It's moved, but when I stop playing, that value reverts to 4.79. So although you can test things out and change them in game mode, those changes won't stay once you return back. Keep that in mind when you're altering what you're doing in the inspector, which mode you're in. In this case, that surrounding gray and the music were a big key that I was playing my game. In the inspector, we can also lock our selection to a certain object even if we deselect it. For example, I'll pick the floor here and click on the lock button. We can see here in the inspector that with the lock on, floor is still showing, even though I've selected on the left side the doll arm. This lets me really modify this particular component to test it out. Maybe, for example, I need to alter how fast a character is moving and want to do it over here on a script in the inspector while I'm viewing other things in my scene or in my game. In the inspector, we can also put icons on objects that maybe don't show as readily in the scene. For example, I have an enemy manager here in the hierarchy. This enemy manager, and I'll unlock my inspector to be able to see it, is a game object with some scripts running on it. Now I can select it in the hierarchy, but I can't see it readily here in the scene. But it may be something that I want to be able to click on in the scene and select. What I'll do is click on the box here, this gray box next to that object, and it's gray because it's not visible in the scene at the moment, and assign an icon. I'll put an orange capsule onto it, and I'll check it, and there it is. Now, even when other things are selected, such as the floor, I still have an enemy manager icon I can click on and select if I need. This provides a way to have one view available in the hierarchy, maybe in a certain area, something else showing in the inspector, and see what objects are where actually in the scene. You can configure these icons as you need. You've got large and small, capsules, spheres, and diamonds. You can also click Other and choose another particular texture if you need, custom making your own icons if you'd like. I'll turn off that enemy manager as it activates only during gameplay, and that icon disappears because it's not visible now in the scene. In the inspector, we also have access to our tags and our layers for organizing our scene, and also for limiting down things like raycasts, for example. We can check things on a certain layer, or tag them so we can recognize them, for example, for a minimap. We can also mark things as static if we need for light baking. We can also use the drop-down here next to static, and choose exactly how it's static. Does it mean that it's static for light map or everything? Or does it simply mean navigation static so we can have objects or characters walk around and so forth? These are very crucial for optimizing the game and putting a measure of intelligence into our characters, for example, or fine-tuning our lighting and baking it or pre-calculating it. In summary, the inspector provides us a method for accessing the components of a particular object to get in and modify them, add components on, move them around, and change how an object behaves or looks in our game. It also provides a way for us to tag or layer different objects to exclude them or include them for sorting and optimization. And finally, if we need to assign an icon to an object that may not be readily visible in the scene or game view, we can put it on here in the inspector. Keep in mind that the inspector, the scene view, and the hierarchy all work together, and that we'll work with all three simultaneously to get done what we need in the course of building our game. The project window is where everything in the game is going to be sorted and organized, categorized so that we can access it and use it optimally. I reopen my Chapter 2 Zombie Toys project, where we can see I have a scratch or working scene called Untitled, and I've got the assets that I brought in from the asset store. I'm going to do some organization here in the project window. Right now these are organized in the way they were brought in. There's the folders that they came in, named animation, audio, fonts, and so forth. In here in the project window, we have a couple of different ways to access and organize what we're doing. To make a new folder then, you can right-click here in the main window and choose Create and Folder. I'll make a new folder, for example, and call it Scratch, and I'll put my working elements in there. This folder shows as open, and anything I drop in will now move out of this main window, such as my scene Untitled, and be in there. Double-clicking on a folder then, such as Scratch, shows me that Untitled scene. We can also see here in the project window on the left side, we have a list or hierarchy view of what's going on, in this case in our assets. I'll pull up the dividing line between them so I have a little more room to move around. And there's my Scratch working folder. We can click on a folder name to rename it, changing from Scratch to Working, for example. These are organized alphabetically, so now Working jumps down to the bottom. The arrow next to the folders denotes that it has child folders. For example, Models has a child Characters, in which are Materials, Player, Player 1, Player 2, and so on. We can roll these up to see our full tree, or open them up to see how deep they're nested if we need. What we also see here in the project window is a breadcrumb trail. In this case, my untitled scene is in Working, which is in Assets, or Assets Working. We can make these icons bigger if we need by using the slider on the bottom, and this is important as these will preview sometimes if it's a working asset. For example, I'll go into Models and Environment, and in the environment, I've got the different pieces that'll make up my Zombie Toys game. I'll select my blocks, and when that slider is way down, we can see all of these objects on one line and a very small preview. But we may want to slide this up and magnify that thumbnail to get a good idea of what that object is. When we select an object here in the project window, we can see it over in the inspector. And in this case, we're seeing the model import settings for that block's object. How big does it think it is when it comes in? Is it set to optimize, and will there be colliders on it, and so forth? Under each of these, we can see there's other objects, as shown by this arrow on the right of the block's object. I'll open that up, and we can see in here is the actual mesh, blocks 1, with 390 verts and 436 tries, and then a block's avatar that the Unity editor has created for us automatically, ready for use in an animator controller or similar when we get ready to possibly animate. Remember that the project window differs from the hierarchy in that the project window has everything in the game in it, all of the assets, which may not be used in every scene in the game. That this is where we bring everything into and organize, categorizing, modifying the file structure of those objects here in the project window. We can create assets here in the project window simply by right-clicking in any open area. I'll right-click and choose Create, and there's Folder, and also different scripts. These are all things that would be components of a game object, such as a C# script attached to a game object performing a particular function in the game. We can create scenes and empty prefabs here in the project window, and then drag them onto the object in the inspector or in the scene if we'd like. We can create materials here in the project window if we need a new material to put on an object, for example. And we can also make things that will help us control animation, such as animator controllers and animator overrides. What we can create here mirrors what we can choose from Assets and Create. It's simply available in another way here in the project window and provides a quick way to make something if we need and organize it while we're doing it. The key in the project window then is to stay organized. Again, this is where we'll modify the file structure of objects in our Unity project, renaming objects if we need, organizing them by folders, by name, by type, for example, or by function. And the project window contains all of the assets we're going to use in our scenes in our game. In the project window, we have a number of different ways to search, organize, and categorize our different objects, our different assets we're going to use. We've seen already how we've got folders available in the Assets window, and we can see that folder tree on the left side. We can also search by name and by type of object if we need. For example, up in the search field at the top of the project window, I'll search for BL, and anything with a BL in the name shows up. What this shows me is that I've got an animator disabler, a blend 2, blocks 1, a blocks avatar, and so forth. Anything having that string, BL, in the name. We can also add to this search by type. For example, I'll click on the button to the right of the search field, and these are object types here in the Unity editor. I'll add into this search mesh. What we can see now is I've got one object that fits those search criteria. Blocks 1, the actual mesh comprising that block object, and up here in the search field, we've got BL and then the type T mesh. We can type these straight in here or use this dropdown as we need, but we can search for these assets very, very specifically by name and by object type. We can even work just by object type if we need. For example, I'll click on this search by type button and search for just audio clips. These are all the audio clips that came in the assets, whatever they're named and wherever they are, because they may be scattered in various folders. I'll uncheck audio clip and I'm back to the main root assets folder. We can tag objects too, and this provides another way to index these objects independently of their type. For example, I'll go into audio and into the effects, and I'll pick the lightning zap, and over in the bottom right in the inspector is a blue tag. I'll click on that blue tag, and I'm going to tag this as audio. Now it shows up with an audio tag here in the preview under the inspector, and when I search here in my project window by tag for audio, because that one object, the lightning zap, is tagged, it shows up. So again, we can categorize in here as we need. This shows, again, that I am searching by an audio tag. It's important to be able to organize, because again, as I've been saying, we may have hundreds of objects coming in from various artists and thousands of objects in our scenes or in our game level, and we need to be able to get in and find specific pieces. What we can see from this also is that it's very possible to have many different effects for a particular character, for example, and we need to be able to get in and find them specifically. If we look under our effects weapons attacks, for example, we can see the different electric attacks we're going to use on the lightning. There's 3 variants of the electricity, and then an equipment. There's a hit, and 3 variations of it. We're seeing a very typical game production workflow here, where we may have multiple variations of objects coming in, lots of little bits we're going to implement in our game. So we need to be able to search and stay organized to find these objects in several different ways. We can even make favorites in here. For example, if I click on all scripts, we'll see all the scripts that are used in the assets folder, and also in the assets store, that there's 999 plus. There are many, many scripts available. We can look in here by all models. Just show me, for example, all of the models that have been brought in. We can look by just materials and see all of the materials that have imported. These materials came in without their textures on them, which is why they're all gray, and we'll need to put those together later. We can look for prefabs. At the moment, we don't have any because we haven't created any. These are simply the assets we've brought in. But to be able to organize here by favorites and view all of a certain very typical class is very important. In summary then, you can stay organized in the project window, and this is where you'll organize all the pieces in your scene. And having good naming, consistent naming, is important. You can search by name, by type, and by tag. And you can also view a hierarchy and unique objects, or search by a favorite particular type of object used very commonly. The more organized you are, the smoother the production of your game will be, as you may be dealing with many artists and game designers making many scenes out of that same project. And so being organized is a must. Layers are an important part of the organization of a scene here in the Unity editor, and allow us to really customize what an object can or can't see, or what it can interact with. I'll pick the floor here in my completed Zombie Toys project. We can see in the inspector in the top right of the screen that this is on a layer, floor, and dropping down here under floor, we can see that other layers are available. Some of these come with Unity and are already there, such as default, transparent effects, ignore raycast, and so forth. We've added on ones, floor, shootable, light mask, and so on, to be able to do different things with these objects. They provide a way to take multiple objects and categorize or recognize them as we need. When we click on Add Layer, our built-in layers are 0 through 7, and there's default, transparent effects, ignore raycast, and so on. And then there's user layers we've added in, floor, shootable, and light mask. We can make a new layer simply by typing it in, calling this one props and pressing enter. And now that'll be available to assign an object to. For example, I'll click on the dresser and assign it to the layer props. And now in a script, I can have it recognize or ignore, for example, anything on that layer props. As an example in here, a lot of the environment may be set to blocking, or the floor is set to floor, so things can't fall below. We can set things to UI, recognizing pieces only as a UI component, and we can also set pieces to, for example, shootable, such as our enemies, the Zombear, Zomduck, and Clown. A key note about layers is that they're useful for optimizing the collisions detected in raycasting. Raycasting is where from one object to another we can determine collision and distance if we need. What we can do then is to tell Raycast to ignore selectively all of the objects on a layer. For example, only raycasting to characters and ignoring everything on the blocking layer, which might be all of the environment. Layers then provide a way to optimize exactly what we need, and more precisely, what we don't need to consider when we're dealing with a rendering. We can use layers to limit down what a camera will see, and also to limit down what a light will hit, telling it to ignore entirely if we need. I'll scroll down then and go into the lighting. And here's my moonlight, the main light in the scene. I'll take that moonlight, and what we can do is under culling mask, tell it to hit everything, hit nothing, or turn off selectively certain layers. Layers then can limit down this moonlight from hitting an object. I'll take props off that selection, and we can see in here that that dresser goes dark. It's now only lit by the fill lights, the blue and purple in the scene, and is exactly not being hit by that moonlight. So it's excluded and optimizing what that moonlight is hitting and therefore rendering. As you're building your game level then, set up layers, because you want to optimize down exactly what you're dealing with to make your game run faster and get a better player experience. I'll reopen that Module 2 Start again and reset my editor. I'll choose File and Open Project. I've reopened the Chapter 2 Zombie Toys project with the assets ready for implementation, and I'll reset my editor, choosing Window and Layouts, and I'll go back to the default layout in here. As you can see, I've reconfigured my project window to be able to move around it and move some of the other windows around. So I'll choose Default, and the Unity editor will reset to its original state. Remember, you can always reset as you need, moving things around and customizing, and coming back to either a save layout or one of the ones that comes with Unity to keep your workflow optimal and present only what you need. In this chapter, we've looked at getting around the Unity Editor interface and what the different windows do. We started out in the project window, looking at how to organize and modify the file structure of assets in our game project. Remember that all the assets in the project window may not be all in one scene at one time. In the scene view, we'll build the scenes that make up our game, pulling in our assets, adding in our characters, lighting the scene, and positioning sound to really bring this game to life. In the scene, we looked at different ways to view, working by shaded or by wireframe, and showing different parts of our materials if we need. We can organize our scene view and work in 2D or 3D, with or without the scene lighting on, and seeing all the different gizmos if we need, or using that gizmo dropdown to sort, organize, and filter in here to restrict down what we see to get to what we need. In the game view, we'll test our game, pressing play at any point to drop in and play, seeing it at the correct aspect and with all the different effects we're going to put on. We can work either in a window or maximize on play and see statistics on how to optimize our game along the way. The hierarchy window keeps us organized, showing all the objects in the scene view, including duplicates, and we can organize that hierarchy window by transform or alphabetically. Remember, staying organized is key because we're going to be dealing with many objects over the course of building our game. We can filter this hierarchy by name, by type, and create native Unity objects in here if we need. In the inspector, we'll modify the components of a particular object, adding on scripts, for example, or changing around how a material looks. Also in the inspector, we'll put objects on layers, restricting down what cameras, lights, and raycasts can or can't see, and optimizing the interaction in our game for smooth gameplay. Now that we've got a good idea how to move around the Unity Editor interface, we'll look in depth at game objects, creating them, defining assets in game objects and prefabs, and getting ready to build our zombie toys game level.